Hi there, everybody. I hope everybody's having a great design week. It's just now 6 o'clock there on the West Coast. I'm actually in Boulder, so I'm in Mountain Time tonight, so it's 7 o'clock my time. But I was just gonna let people trickle in for the next couple minutes before I got started here. But I'm really excited about this. I've been anticipating this talk for several weeks now. Being a part of Design Week is kind of one of those things you just kind of dream about as an artist and designer. So I'm really excited to be here, and I was really excited to see the sign up list. I was honestly expecting like 5 to 10 signups, and there was over 50 or so people when I last checked a few days ago. So really exciting for that. I'm really excited to see Design Week taking off here. Also, just a little note, while I'm doing the presentation, I'm not going to really have access to see the chat. So if you have questions and you want to put them in the chat, by all means do that. I plan on leaving some time at the end of the talk to answer some questions. So yeah, by all means, go ahead and put that in there. It's just I'm not going to be able to see the questions until the very end of the presentation. All right. Well, I'm going to get started here, and I'd like to just thank San Diego Design Week for inviting me here. My name is Joshua English, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm an artist and designer who's now based in San Diego. I was in the Bay Area for 28 years. I went to art school at Sonoma State back in the early 90s. And also just recently finished an interior architecture and design degree at Academy of Art. But all my family lives down in San Diego, so when it came time to relocate, I can't believe it took me so long to actually move down south. So I'm proud to say that I'm an artist and a designer who is based in San Diego. In San Diego, I run a startup called Occamworks Labs, and we're a systems-minded design firm. And what we specialize in is applying a multidisciplinary approach to solving everyday design challenges that humans face. Our current focus is developing a patent-pending mycelium-based biocomposite that's made from agricultural waste, bound in a self-replicating matrix of fungal mycelium. Our innovative technique uses a very low-tech means of growing mycelium-based biocomposites or mycocomposites, capable of serving in load-bearing capacities. We're designing the first generation of regenerative building materials that have a net negative embodied carbon during its manufacture, and still at the end of its usable life cycle, it's backyard compostable. So really proud to be running this startup, and excited to be here at Design Week. And the topic that we're talking about today is a matter of life and death, really. Or more accurately, it's a matter of climate and planetary emergency. We are without a doubt living in a state of planetary overshoot. We are consuming our planet's resources at accelerated rates, and exponential population growth, coupled with a cavalier mindset that promotes unlimited growth in farming and industry, is hastening the collapse of many of the vital systems that all life on this planet relies upon. The problem is one of basic arithmetic, and we've had knowledge of the alarming answer to this math problem for the last 50 years. And we've made very little progress in tackling the most pressing issues that we face. That 1972 publication, Limits to Growth, was the first attempt at applying a systems-based modeling tool to answering this key question: how quickly will we run out of resources if we remained on the trajectory that we were on back in the 1970s? A new, at the time, computer modeling tool created by a gentleman at MIT, Jay Forrester, called World 3, allowed these investigators to run a series of tests given a series of certain assumptions about population versus death rates, for instance, or resource depletion versus resource allocation, and like I mentioned, and the rate at which overshoot of our planet's resources has the ability to cause the kind of environmental collapse that will render our planet inhospitable to the kind of wondrous biodiversity that we see now. The answers that the investigators got from running cell scenarios showed us that we had designed a system, an industrial system that was geared towards collapse. We designed methods of farming and industry that were certain to create environmental degradation that would cause societal collapse within a few generations. Limits to growth was a clarion call that gave a glimmer of hope to avoid that cataclysm, but it went largely unheeded. You know, the truth is that the planet that we live on is largely disinterested in biology. That is to say, there were tens of millions of years with no life at all. And the physical world dispassionately goes on about the business of burning and churning as a result of the effects of gravity. And our sun pays no mind to our ogling of its beauty as it rises and falls on the horizon. But when life emerged 3.5 billion years ago, it multiplied and diversified in an unimaginably, let me say that one more time, an unimaginably complex web. The flora, the fauna, and the fungi rely on each other to achieve a balance or equilibrium. And when the equilibrium of the biosphere is intact, living things can exist in concert with the dispassionate physical world. Living things can accept the ebbs and flows of the yearly cycles, and living things can exhibit the kind of resilience to manage the kind of turmoil caused by cataclysmic events. The biosphere understands the math, and the equilibrium that the biosphere is constantly seeking, it promotes a certain mutualism among organisms. That mutualism takes its moral cues from the physical world, and that is to say, it seems like such a cruel, uncaring world, but when we think about equilibrium, it's almost somewhat beyond our current comprehension how nature achieves balance through events like extinctions. The very finely calibrated web of life can make small changes for the greater good in order to keep the balance. The sad part is that anthropogenic or human-caused pressures on the biosphere as a direct result of the Industrial Revolution have caused a rift between our species and the rest of the biosphere. Our wielding of technology has manipulated the biosphere in alarmingly reckless ways. And it wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for this one simple fact, and that's that we aren't just messing it up for humans. We're messing it up for all of the living things in the biosphere. Now, I promise that this call to action is dire, but I actually hold out a lot of hope for the future. But I think it's really important that we have to state the problem clearly and plainly, and we must limit our impact, period, plain and simple. We must limit growth, and we must accept that we, especially in the United States, we need to adjust our modes of manufacture and consumption. Because it's not a time for arguing over who is to blame. We all bear the burden to a certain extent. We know that there are some glaring facts we can ignore, but only at our own peril. These are just a smattering of the unflattering truths about how deep of a hole that we're in right now. For instance, 38 to 40% of arable land or farmable land has been degraded. At a time when food insecurity rises for a growing portion of the population, our modes of consumption, take, make, and waste has caused massive deforestation. Indeed, less than 1/5 of the Earth's forests are intact. Our management of our forest resources that had once been thought as renewable, has resulted in immature forests with indelibly changed ecosystems. These local biomes hardly bear any resemblance to the resources that were extracted from them. It's the sad fact that upwards of 65% of every tree that's harvested from the forest is lost to waste before it ends up as a product. Just let that sink in for a moment. 65% of every tree that's harvested is lost to waste. Another uncomfortable fact of our current trajectory is that while preservation of the temperate forests have largely stabilized, deforestation and forest degradation of the tropical forests are accelerating. And this is largely due to cattle grazing and industrial farming like that we see in the palm oil markets. The loss of biodiversity per hectare of tropical forests is only overshadowed by the exponential and added calamity of the loss of one of the biosphere's best tools for storing carbon deep underground where it belongs. And this is not even getting to the greed that ensures the perpetuation of the ever-widening gap between the rich and poor. Put plainly, we have to limit our growth. All right, yeah, I understand that this is kind of a grim message, and maybe we've been foolish to not have heeded the warnings, and things look bad. And we didn't heed these scarily accurate predictions that were made 50 plus years ago. We see the effects of them daily. I've been driving across the United States, and you can see the fire smoke from the fires in California, as far as the Rockies, where I'm at right now. The air is choked with the predictable results of the insatiable appetites that we have for more and more and more. Now, again, I am asking you to trust me that this message, I promise, is a positive one. But I can't assume that everyone is singing from the same sheet. You know, we live in a world where short-sighted goals conflict with our very existence. My message is as positive as the problem is dire. We consumed our way right past the scenarios where we could see change without undue turmoil. And we've blown right past those mile markers. And it seems like half of us don't care and the other half can't find any hope. But here we are in the present day, and things seem way out of control. Here we are knowing what we know now, and still we find ourselves unable to affect the kind of change we'd like to see. But I think just maybe as we sit here right now, knowing that our choices, our professional and personal choices, have willingly contributed to these problems, and even though that some of us are even more horrified knowing that there are a whole slew of other choices made on our behalf that make us even more numb and even more hopeless, I promise you there is a lot of hope in the future. We just have to avoid the complacency by always reminding ourselves of this one simple mission. We need to keep our planet habitable. But we can't despair. And let me be very clear. What I see here in this slide is not despair. This is the face of action and humility coupled with courage. I see this person as the archetype of hope, actually. The embodiment of what makes up the best qualities of what we need right now. Because we know that they know that we know we have to make changes. We can't hide out. Because as the question always is asked, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? Because we can't save it for future generations anymore. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're including the youth and the young people in the problem solving. We can't despair because that's not how we will transform our broken systems into regenerative ones. We can't despair even when it seems like the lines that divide us are being drawn over and over and over again. And we see so much mistrust in systems and institutions at a time when we need trust in those same systems and institutions. There's so much mistrust in science right now, which results in misinformation masquerading as fact. We can't despair, even though the greed, the time has come for us to replace the greed with mutualism. And we can't despair, even though we see how our daily lives are impacted by climate change. Even though the rates of degradation are increasing and it feels like it's one step forward, 2 or 3 steps back, we can't despair because we have a responsibility to find some kind of starting point for change, for transformation. We have a responsibility to put ourselves on the front lines, and we have to be day one type of people, not one day type of folks. We have to demand day one solutions, and we can't despair when we know that through action, we actually have so much reason for hope, actually. And I want to put a bow on this cheery portion of the talk here, just to say this, that the web of life is in immediate danger. We are one bad day away from the worst case scenarios happening. But again, I find hope in the notion that the COVID year brought some clarity to certain realities for us. And now we can have frank dialogue on topics that had always been shunned before. COVID taught us that our supply chains are literally killing people. COVID taught us that our supply chains are easily interrupted. Globally, certain playing fields were leveled, while others were exposed as increasingly unfair. We learned that change, dramatic change, is possible when we unite for equitable causes. And we also learned in the starkest way that nature's solution to excess is an increase in death rates. And that caused us to pause and reconsider our real place within the biosphere. We know that change can occur rapidly with enough will. So we can begin to focus that will and that impetus towards the problems that we face today. You see, the data that we have to go on, they're very important to show us the probabilities. But it is well within our collective capabilities to begin to envision alternate endings, actually. We can free ourselves from undesirable probabilities by seeking out new possibilities. It is undeniable that things are only knowable, or I'm sorry, it's undeniable that things are only unknowable until they are not. It is also undeniable that by working in a mutually beneficial way, we can uncover the unknowable, perhaps in enough time to come back from the precipice. Again, the data shows us probabilities, and those probabilities don't look so good. But through collective action, we can find different possibilities for this planet that we live on. So I promised that this was going to be a positive presentation, and I'm going to follow through with that promise. I'll make good on that for the rest of the talk here. But I really do believe that we have to talk about how we got here and why, in order to provide the appropriate context for what we need to do in order to transform our own way of thinking and doing and relating. Now, I'm an interior designer myself, but I have a real passion for holistic building design and all of the disciplines that go into that approach. So most of my examples of regenerative design come from that realm of the built environment, but at its core, though, regenerative design just seeks equilibrium with the biosphere. By definition, then, regenerative design moves beyond sustainability and evolves to include as a goal seeking out solutions that contribute to regenerating those systems that we've already degraded. So if we were to try and only sustain these systems, we would still deplete the biosphere. Instead, we need to begin placing impact to the biosphere directly into the fundamental design process itself. We, as designers, are tasked with making choices on each and every project. Those choices have deeply rooted effects on our immediate biome, as well as the larger biosphere. You and I have within our professional duties an obligation to start thinking about how we can use our work as engines for change. You know, just as we critique a design based on its impact on our informed senses of style, we need to have that same ability to critique a project based on its deeper answering of the questions that we face, the regenerative questions. We need to ask questions of the projects. Are we able to have the ability to restore and regenerate through our work? It's not enough to eat vegan and wear B Corp brands. And don't get me wrong, I'm actually all for that. I'm encouraging that, for instance. But that's just not enough to live an awakened personal life as a designer. We need to bring that same zeal to our professional lives. And it'd be a tough road, I think, but I think that the reward is far greater than any suffering that we might experience along the way. But the more important paradigm shifts that we need to adopt when adopting the regenerative mindset is the adoption of a systems-based approach. Systems-based thinking begins by eliminating our goofy egos from the design process altogether. We can also learn how to build better, equitable built environments as well. We can learn how to use the resources more equitably. We know that mere sustainability now is no longer sustainable. So we have to move beyond sustainability by recognizing the need to widen our vision in the very beginning of a project. And we need to maintain our laser focus on executing that widened vision throughout the build process. And we also need to have visibility into the long-term effects of our design decisions. I think that the design process needs some amending, actually, and it needs to include, before even conceptual brainstorming begins, brainstorming, in fact, instead on the system-wide impacts that you and your client want to make, because system thinking empowers both the designer and the client to see the project as always having an impact, always. It's always going to have an impact on the biosphere. It can then help to guide choices later on when you've had those discussions up front. Because our choices as designers and as clients determine whether the project has a positive or negative impact on the bio. So a systems approach to design doesn't require you to take on more responsibility, but it doesn't require you to responsibly ensure that your choices are made with full transparency. System thinking also leans on mutual benefit as a core belief, not just as an ideal, but as an embodiment. It has to be that we are bold enough as designers to reject the notion that we are going to consume our way out of this mess. The timeline, remember, is well past that point. Our role is central to so many aspects of the built environment, or even to fashion or marketing or product design. I'm asking you right now, do you have the design chops to forego expediency in the name of regeneration? Because I think it's time to stop putting too much blame on the consumer, because I think the primacy with some of the problems that we face lies with designers, because even bad design required bad decisions at one point. As the saying goes, if you play silly games, you win silly prizes. Well, we've had this dogmatic view that unlimited growth is good for a company. And we convinced ourselves that demand fueled supply, but we've got to come to terms with our legacy of short-sighted design approaches. Approaches that enable single use of precious resources or that ignore end-of-life cycle issues. Those approaches have to be weeded out of design practices altogether. Our system is perfectly designed to be getting the results we are currently getting. That is to say, we've acquiesced on the design side and on the consumer side. We have accepted the lunacy of single-use plastics, for example. If we knew the real cost of our choices, would we still make the same choices? Not all consumers are designers, but all designers are consumers and specifiers and decision makers. So I really do think that it's time for us to start amplifying our voices as change makers, actually. And we need to start scrutinizing in our own designs. Are we contributing to a real or a perceived solution? To scrutinize those entities and items that we amplify, is it something, we could ask of ourselves, is this a solution without a problem? If we think that it's something that's necessary, are we satisfied with our choices? Are we being honest and transparent with the community at large, with our coworkers, with ourselves, with our clients? I think this is the real first step in regenerative design, and that's just abject transparency, actually. I think it's always good to encapsulate things in buckets. And so my take on regenerative design, and it's such a new way of thinking, and it's so wide open that really it's something that you can take some principles and then you can apply it to your own practice. But I believe that if you start with 3 main questions for every design, you can avoid some of the problematic endings that end up plaguing a lot of design projects. The first of those questions, am I really solving a problem? The second question is, does my solution improve patterns of consumption? And the third question I think we need to ask is, can the solution be executed with a systems-based focus on equity? And that's probably the hardest of the 3 questions. And they're cascading questions. And I believe that you shouldn't move on until you've answered yes to each of those 3 questions. And each of these questions only give us actually a starting point to a space to ask even deeper questions, fundamental questions later on in the design process, and then to kind of categorize them so that we can make informed choices later on. As designers, sometimes we're going to be faced with the need to to make really hard decisions just based on necessity and the lack of availability sometimes. But let's dive deeper into the first question, actually. It's an important question and a devilishly simple one to ask. Your design decisions, your decision to design something implies that resources need to be used. So I'm not saying this to stifle innovation. In fact, just the opposite. I think instead we need to use our collective expertise to help drive appropriate innovation. That is to say, we don't want to be creating widgets for their own sake. And it just may be possible that your greatest design contribution actually is the design you decided not to make, actually. Because it's worth restating that we are not going to consume our way out of this jam. So we have to be rigorous in honestly answering the first question, am I solving a problem? Because if the answer is yes, great, get to work. But if the answer is no, then it's not necessarily implied, but it can and should be asked, am I causing a problem? Oof, because this is a real moment of truth for us as designers. Nobody's going to be standing over your shoulder to help you hold yourself accountable. Because true change actually happens when people make the right choices, but especially when other people aren't looking, actually. And so can we make it part of our way of doing business, not just the way we describe our way of doing business? When faced with a choice between value for profit or value for people and for planet, who in the room is going to stand up for the biosphere? And I firmly believe that one of the deepest impacts that we can have as designers is deeply rooted in our ability to educate clients and the public. Because I believe that armed with information, presented in a compassionate way, people will make the right choices. A perfect example is this house, and if you studied architecture or interior design, you'll recognize this, and few can argue that this iconic structure is not an important editorial step forward. But with all due respect to the designers and the architects, there are some glaringly obvious issues that just jump right out with this building right away. And once you see past the beauty and you realize that utility is non-existent here, you have to start to realize that if a client asks you for a greenhouse to live in like this, you need to educate them on ways to build healthy houses. Educate them on the thermal qualities of having all glass walls and not even the hint of one eave to reduce the intensity of the sun. That's an opportunity we have to educate people. And I think that that's part of the core of regenerative design is, first of all, using this vocabulary, telling people sustainability is dead. We're done with that. What we need to start doing is restoring and regenerating. And is our design doing that? What I think is wonderful, though, that this house does get right is that it practically disappears into the forest. And in spite of its Mars-like temperature extremes, I'm sure that when the conditions are right inside, that the outside-in concept in this building is nailed. But at what expense is really the question we have to ask. Regenerative design seeks equilibrium. And so how can we make choices that align with our ideals in that respect? And I think right here is a great opportunity to talk about one of the more prescriptive concepts I want to impart here, and that's that we can impart what is known as biophilic design principles into our design processes, and that's going, I think, to help us make regenerative design choices. E.O. Wilson didn't coin the phrase, but he did describe it quite eloquently in a book that I highly recommend titled Biophilia. And in the foreword, he describes biophilia, or defines it as the innate tendency for humans to focus on life and lifelike processes. And so if we're going to design biophilically, one of the first things we can do is include place-based features in our designs. One of the great things about doing that is that we then have this focus of using regionally appropriate materials in our designs. So that's one of the ways having this biophilic approach actually dovetails and enhances our use of regenerative design principles. And the other thing that's great about using place-based materials in our designs and place-based features in our designs is that it's something that's accessible to everybody. This is a very simple hut that's here, but it's so beautifully eloquent the way that it sits there and interacts with the environment with the sweeping shapes there. And so that's something that's available to rich and poor alike, including these place-based features in homes. Another way that we could do it is just by reminding urban dwellers of the natural world that might be within the communities that they live in, or without the communities, just outside the boundaries of these communities, helping people just to reconnect, even in ways that aren't entirely accurate to nature. Using fake nature inside has a positive effect on people's use of that building space. I think another way we could use place-based features too is to incorporate and have more fun with more senses, using the sense of smell or touch in our designs to make this deeper connection to the built environment. I think another thing we could do is include environmental features. This corridor here is what I consider a more evolved use of heavy glazing on the side of a building to bring the outside in, but there's more of a functional overhang here so that it's not just creating this hothouse for all the building to suffer from. It's bringing the outside in very wonderful ways here. So including these environmental features helps us to also realize that our buildings are the built environment, our projects exist in the biosphere. So when we're including the outside in our projects, we're including that recognition of how the biosphere interplays with our projects and vice versa. I think another thing that's also important to incorporate with a biophilic design is we need to include biological and natural shapes, patterns and forms that are biologically derived, just feel good to people. And if you haven't done a deep dive into the use of the golden section in your practice, I would highly recommend learning how to use that. That wonderful constant 1.6180339 goes on for quite a big ways there for infinity. It's such an eloquent way to think about how to break up a blank canvas. If you have questions about how to proportion something, using this golden ratio helps to make spaces that feel more appropriate, feel more spaced out, feel more natural. Nature is math, and I think that to design like nature, we need to, as designers, need to embrace math. And it might seem counterintuitive, but I think a way that we can design more biophilically and therefore more regeneratively is by using math, actually. I think another thing by using environmental features that we can do is, can we have that environmental feature serve a function in our design? Can it serve more than one function? That way we're actually using, taking cues from nature. Nature doesn't have a lot of single-use things. Nature likes to have things that are multifunction. When we have things that are multifunction, like this corridor here, what you're allowing people to do when they're interacting with your design is they're building these emotional connections to the environmental, and that helps in the long run. When people are used to buildings like this over time, then it's going to be easier to make design choices that are more biophilic, more regenerative, because we have a deeper experience of what the built environment is like. Another really important thing that I think we can do is we can imbue natural rhythms, especially of light and dark, but also warmth and coolness. We can embrace decay. We can celebrate change. In that way, when we make our designs that incorporate these changes and celebrate these types of changes, then we can actually find ourselves regeneratively designing, because we're using the building's situation on the piece of property to capture light, and we're encouraging the people's use of that building to flow with the light. And so those are ways that we can use biophilic design to enhance our achievement of regenerative design. I think also design that celebrates and encourages a reorientation of humans to our place in the biosphere is really important. And I think we can use things like scale and texture in ways that humble the human and create this sense of mystery that is kind of inherent in nature. I think we need to create this sense of reorientation to the biosphere locally, but also globally. And I think reminding people of that delicate web, again, helps to then make the built environment that engine of change where we can start to then have the discussion about material choices and how they affect not just the design itself, but how it affects the biosphere. Because I think when people relate to something living or not living, even physical or conceptual, they can allow accommodations that ensure that mutualism is successful. And we have to believe the glass is half full right now, because we have to ensure that everybody's glass is half full, because things are going to get rough otherwise. One of the last things we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking regeneratively is, am I improving patterns of consumption? I should have said that this is the second question we want to ask ourselves. And I think that when we're talking about patterns of consumption, as designers, what we're talking about here is really the choices, the material choices that we make. I really think that materials are so important. It's the most important aspect of a designer's job, I think. So if you ask yourself the question, do you know the process for how the material is made? If you don't know, find out, and then go back and ask yourself, does that process align with your concept and the client's concept of regeneration? And if not, maybe you need to find an alternative material. If you know the process and it seems to pass muster, then do you know the composition of that material? I think when we know what materials we're putting into the built environments, we're less likely to make mistakes later on. So knowing the composition is quite important. And if you don't know, find out. As a materials designer myself, I'm all too happy to talk about materials. So if you ask somebody who's supplying you with the material about the process, I'm sure they're happy to tell you. I think it's also to use materials properly. The properties meet the needs of the challenge. It's important to know that when we're choosing materials, it's not going to cause that planned obsolescence that has been so inherent in design over the last several decades. We need to embrace a certain set of notions, like better than bad does not equal good, or just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think importantly, we need to start planning for the end of life cycles at the very outset of all of our design projects, because we need to be thinking in terms of resource use being less than or equal to the depreciation. We need to design from the outset with the end in mind. And so by doing that, we're thinking of ways of closing loops of circularity, because one man's trash, as the saying goes, is another man's raw material. So if we start taking back and reusing and refurbishing things, there's some great examples of companies like Patagonia and Vivo Barefoot, are these companies that will take and refurbish items at the end of life cycle. We need this to be a common practice, not the exception to the rule, but the rule itself. These follow-on economies just actually seem to make economic sense. And so if we start with the end in mind, guess what? It just seems like we're going to be making better decisions in the long run anyways. I think when we start thinking about end of life too, it helps us to avoid these practices that end up being the kind of things that we're not very proud of. I spent some time in the hospitality design world, and the dirty little secret is that most hotels have a 3 to 5 year cycle where they're changing out just about all this stuff inside. It's a staggering number of something like 2 million television sets are deposited in landfills every year because of the hospitality design industry. And we need to change that pattern of consumption. And it's up to us as designers. If we're an interior designer and you're specifying materials, you're specifying electronics, are you also specifying the way that electronic device is going to be disposed of at the end of its useful life? This is regenerative design at its core. This is systems thinking at its core. If there's something that you are incorporating into your design, a thing has a cost, and we need to be accounting for that cost as designers. One of the last things, or the very last thing that I think we need to ask ourselves, and if we can't answer yes to this, then I think we need to make some hard decisions about whether or not this is something we actually need to do. And that is to ask ourselves, am I the embodiment of equity? Does my solution promote equity? Have I even asked who is being impacted by these design decisions? And if there are people that are being impacted by them, have I let them weigh in? Have I made choices that honor the equitable use of resources in the biosphere and the distribution of wealth? It's the hardest question to ask because greed is such a strong motivator. But we have to start asking these questions as designers. And we have to be bold enough as designers to start turning down work if we know that it's not going to end up in an equitable use of resources. You know, the truth is that we're doing this because biodiversity matters. It's important. We've eclipsed so many third rails, it's not even funny. And it's going to be a bumpy ride, that is for certain. And we have to redefine our systems of wealth and refocus on mutual health and happiness. We need to refocus on resilience, building communities that are resilient, are healthy and happy communities. And if we reorient ourselves to that way of thinking and not to just glitz and glamour for the sake of glitz and glamour, I think we're going to be more responsible as designers and we'll be able to achieve that regeneration that we're tasked with achieving. We have to remember that we caused this actually, and there is only time for action, because if we're going to make enough impact now to allow enough time for this transformation to happen, we have to keep focused. We have to keep going. We have to remember that as designers, we have the responsibility to shape the future through our work. Are we contributing to more rampant consumption, or are we offering opportunities for regeneration? Remember, we caused this. We caused this. And if we ask ourselves, does it matter? And we have to remind ourselves that, yeah, it matters to this one. That's what we have to remind ourselves. It matters to this one. It's like that story of the starfish. And if you've heard it before, bear with me. And if you hadn't, I think it encapsulates the spirit of what we need to be doing right now. A young girl grew up visiting her grandfather, who lived on the coast in South Carolina. And every summer she would go visit him for weeks at a time, and they would spend most of their time walking up and down the beach collecting seashells. Well, one summer she was visiting, hundreds of starfish were washed up on the shore. And the little girl just got to work immediately and starts throwing them back in. Well, after an hour, the grandfather was a little annoyed by this because she wasn't stopping. And so he goes over there and says, you realize that 20 more are washing up for every one you toss back in. And without breaking a stride, she picks up another one and looks at him incredulously and says, well, it matters to this one. And she throws it back in. He couldn't argue with that logic. And so he picked up a starfish and he started throwing them in. And people that were walking up and down the beach noticed this group of people doing this act. And so more and more people joined in. And by the time the sun went down that evening, most of the beach was cleared of those starfish. Now, we don't have to talk about the validity of throwing starfish back in the ocean. That's not the moral of the story. The moral of the story is that if it's not you, then who? If it's not now, then when? And if we act now, then we can have enough time to make the changes that we need in order to survive the calamity that we're facing right now. If you'd like to find out more about my work, you can visit structuralmycelium.co, or you can email me at joshua@occamworks.co. The easy way to get in touch with me also is just to visit the San Diego Design website. The San Diego Design Week website, where you can just look up this talk. I guess a video of this talk will also be available on that website. I hope you guys enjoy some more of Design Week, and I think we have a little bit of time. Yes, we have about a minute. I'm going to go to the chat here and see if there's any questions here. I saw heartbreaking facts and numbers. Yes, they are heartbreaking, but I have to say that I think that it's the kind of heartbreak that encourages us to act. We have to act now. And like I said, I think that the fact that we as designers actually have so much power to invoke change, we need to just take that very seriously. Learn more. This is obviously not an exhaustive class on regenerative design. And if you're in design school and they don't have a class on this, demand it, teach it, learn more about regenerative design and do more in this mindset. Bring this up in the design meetings. It's the only way that I think we're gonna survive. So thanks a lot to everybody. Our time has come to the end here. Again, thanks to San Diego Design Week for inviting me. I hope to come back next year. And also thanks to the folks at Nanesh Printing. They were able to give me some beautiful posters that we're able to put around town. Design Week is just so wonderful for the way that people come together. So love to be a part of the San Diego design community, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the weekend.